philosophy, but to look at policy that patients and providers had created. So it was a very, very challenging political process to get this moving. I was blocked for 3 years. A lot of the supervisors in San Francisco did not want to touch task force legislation because it would take so much orchestration. We have a very diverse community. We have sort of what we refer to as the good old boys who really take a lot of entitlement and ownership over what they see as the cannabis community. You have the patients who have huge networks across the city, Access of Love only being one, and then you have the more progressive providers, and nobody wanted to endanger their staff to be in the room with all of us trying to work together as a community. And from the last 3 years, our community has learned we either work together or we get nowhere.
Could you please update us about the number of plants allowed? Did the task force deal with that issue?
Well, what kind of happened in the process of getting, once the supervisor had been sworn in and elected, I took a small group of people to meet with the supervisor and let him know that the cannabis community really needed some help self-regulating and organizing our community from the city. Basically, we needed a leader. We needed somebody who was going to be fair to all people, not just wealthy people, not just wealthy lobbyists, not the people that can walk in and say, hey, you know, if you let me get a permit for this area, I'll put in X and Y and Z amount to improve the neighborhood. We need those people. But we also need somebody who understands the needs of the individual patients in our communities and their rights. So David's very good and very even with that, and I took in the Aldriches, who are a historic part of our community, 30 years in legislative working, Michael Aldrich, Dr. Aldrich being our community's key archivalist, our historian, and Michelle being one of the leaders in government relations for the last 30 years. And then I also had with me attorney Patrick Goggin, who has become, you know, an instrumental part of the compassionate community in San Francisco. And he also has wonderful skills at taking the ideas from basically Access of Love as a patient advocacy team, and taking the patient advocacy team's ideas and mapping them out so that they make legislative sense to the Board of Supes. We can't ask for a better ally than what we have in Patrick Goggin and his government relations assistant, Steph Tucker. So we had a meeting with Supervisor Campos, who made a commitment that he was going to help create the task force, and the task force will revisit our ordinance and construct it a little bit tighter, pull in a few things for the community. And one of the things that we're working on currently, and one of the things that happened recently, which was just an evolution of our relationship with our city government, was that at our working group meeting, which our working group meeting can have anywhere from 30 to 60 people in a room, right? And we're going to keep those meetings ongoing. But the actual legislative task force, of course, is going to be much smaller with delegates. But to the working group, it's been meeting since March, and there's been a lot of growth, and there's been a lot of, you know, learning about each other and learning to trust each other and work together. But one of the things that was brought to us was by the health department, and they were going to limit the amount of starter plants, or what we refer to in cannabis culture as clones, that each cooperative or collective could distribute to its members. And from a patient advocacy point, limiting the amount, basically what it was going to do is just leave the patients with very few slim pickings, it would be like a restaurant selling 4 hamburgers a day. Right? It doesn't make sense. It makes absolutely no sense. There were many other things that Martin Olive brought to the discussion from Vapor Room that were critical regarding our constitutional rights as providers, as far as not self-incriminating and etc., with record keeping and etc. So this whole draft ordinance that had been kind of plopped on our working group before we had even legislated ourselves into task force, we were able to construct from one meeting about 7 points of unity that we all agreed upon and that we all wanted to see changed within this document. Through communication help, through legislative aide Lynette Peralta Haynes, who also facilitates these very difficult meetings. So if you have any love for cannabis and know who Lynette Peralta Haynes is, please, bow down every time you see her, because she's taken so much of her background in coalition building and brought it to our community.
I love working with Lynette.
Yeah, personally, I just really adore her, and her heart is in the right place.
Sure is.
Which is a difficult thing to find at City Hall, I'm telling you. It is a difficult thing to find amongst politicians. But basically, we rejected the health department's proposal. And it was set for a hearing this month. The wonderful thing is that the health department got back to the working group, not even legislated yet, got back to the working group and said, you know what, we'll postpone the hearing. We want to sit down, we want to meet with you, we want to create something that works better. That is the goal. That is the ultimate goal of the task force, is to be able to create self-regulating tools that the city government accepts. And we did it without the legislation. But now we're getting into the point which by October we'd like to have the task force legislated. We'd like to see the task force taking on some of the responsibilities of permitting and operations and hearing complaints in the future. But our first goals are going to be really looking at the MCD ordinance and what changes do both communities, being patient advocacy members, drug policy members, and merchants, agree on the changes that we need to make in the upcoming year. And this year for medical cannabis is going to be huge, because right now we are expecting I believe via the resolution that David Campos was able to get out about needing clear written policy, we have an expectation of seeing that policy from the House Appropriations of Congress by November, is what I've heard through the grapevine. So once we get clear written federal policy, it's going to change a lot of the roadmap of where we can go with medical cannabis and how available we can make it to people, and most importantly, how affordable we can make it to people.
And a wide gene pool is very important.
Right, and changing the genetics and making sure that we're getting genetics out there that actually help people. So cannabis science has a lot of room to grow.